Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Gabrielle Orsi. I'm a program manager for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and along with my colleague Peyton Messersmith, I'll be shepherding along this webinar, providing support to our presenter. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. It's always difficult to know what to do and to say in the face of a massive historical injustice, but we wanted to take a moment to simply reflect that the lands on which we reside, work, and play are ancestral homelands and traditional territories of a number of indigenous peoples who've been here since time immemorial. This reflection can call us to commit to learn to be better stewards of these lands through action, advocacy, support, education, and striving for justice in our communities. We'll put in the chat a great resource from a website called Native Land, which enables us all to learn more about the lands on which we inhabit, work, and play. And in a changing of gears, which I hope does not feel too abrupt, I'd like to say a few words about our National Mental Health Technology Transfer Center network. The MHTTC network is a nationwide network that is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. Our network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. There are also networks that are structured similarly for addiction and prevention. The MHTTC network supports resource development and dissemination training and technical assistance, as well as workforce development for the mental health field. Specifically, we at the Northwest MHTTC cover that top left corner of the map, the states of Alaska, Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. And this pink circle is us. So a little bit more about our center specifically. Our goals are to accelerate the adoption and implementation of mental health-related evidence-based practices, to heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, and to foster alliances and address training needs among diverse partners. We also ensure the availability and delivery of free, publicly available training and technical assistance like today. We have a special area of focus, which is evidence-based practices for serious mental health issues such as psychosis, but we do provide training on quite a wide range of topics, including integrated care, suicide prevention, diversity and equity issues, school mental health, peer support, trauma-informed approaches, and much more. Our target workforce includes behavioral health and primary care providers, school and social service staff, and others whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or at risk of developing serious mental illnesses. We fulfill our mission through all the resources listed on this slide, anything from live virtual events like today to learning communities, free online courses, our newsletter, and more. So we invite you to visit our our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay abreast of everything we're offering and doing. And now a word about language. At the MHTTC network, one of our goals is to utilize affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all the work that we are involved in. We want to remain mindful of all the different perspectives that might come up in these events, and we ask everyone, please, to communicate using language that is respectful, non-judgmental, inclusive, and accepting of the great diversity that we might all be experiencing in this room: cultures, genders, abilities, experiences, and more. This session is being recorded. And next up, a little bit drier perhaps, is some housekeeping issues. I know folks might be very familiar with Zoom by this point. But just a reminder that if you're in the audience, you're muted and you're off camera. This event is being recorded. There is closed captioning on. It's auto-generated, so we apologize if it's not perfectly accurate. We will share the video recording and slides and send instructions on how to obtain a certificate of attendance in a few weeks. We ask that you use the chat box to share comments, greetings, observations, ask for technical assistance, those kinds of things. But if you have a question for our presenter, Carol, today, we ask that you use the QA box, and you can do this at any point throughout the presentation. We're monitoring the QA box to facilitate answering as many questions as possible at the end of today's presentation. Questions put there are much easier for us to retrieve later. In the chat, they might be a little bit lost. Unfortunately, we can't move your question ourselves from chat to QA, so we may ask you to retype it into the QA so we can access it later to make sure it gets answered. Quick disclaimer, although we are funded by SAMHSA, what we're saying and talking about today is not an official position of SAMHSA. I won't bore you with reading all this fine print. And finally, it's really important to us both to improve what we do and to make sure that we track what we do and that's to getting your feedback. So your feedback is really critical to our work. We have a brief survey for you to take at the end of this training. We'll email it to you. You will not escape getting our link. We definitely want your feedback. It keeps the free trainings coming. Your responses are confidential. If you've been at one of our events before, you'll be familiar with this pretty basic survey. It does ask for a personal code. Do not let the long list of, you put in a telephone number here and a zip code there, deter you. Invent any personal code you want. Nobody's keeping track of it. The survey is designed for more intensive trainings where the personal code helps us connect various parts. That's not happening today. This is a one-time event, so invent any code you like. It doesn't truly matter. And we apologize if the code feels a bit onerous or if the prompts seem odd or invasive. We are required by SAMHSA to conduct the survey. So again, your participation is really appreciated and we thank you in advance. Okay, so now I'm very pleased to present Carol Dickey. Carol is the parent of 5 children and a passionate advocate for behavioral health system transformation through elevation of the family voice and an interaction over intervention approach to service delivery. Drawing on more than 3 decades of experience in health services administration and agency leadership, her advocacy efforts are driven by her family's experiences within the child-serving systems. They are inspired by the stories of frustration, hurt, and helplessness shared by countless families so often forced to survive in crisis. I'm really pleased to welcome Carol. I'm really excited about this talk. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Carol. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here, and it is amazing to see all of the names rolling in from locations all across the country. So welcome to all of you. I am going to just share my slides and we can get started. Right here. So as Gabrielle said, I am, among other things, the parent of 5 children. And today they range in age from 12 to 23. And they are a gamer, a problem solver, an advocate, an artist, and a recent college graduate learning to adult. They are caring and curious and interested and tentative and bold. And some of them really like pineapple on pizza, and some of them don't get that at all. Not one of them ever wants to join me when I set off for a long walk in the rain. They are the same. They're different. They're changing every day. And like all of us, they're learning to make their way in this world. Some of my children experience complex behavioral health challenges and neurodevelopmental differences, and all of them are more. They are so much more than the labels by which I've just described them. And they're much, much more than the diagnostic labels imposed on them in order to receive the services and supports they need to be well and to thrive. In this country, only 1 out of 5 children living with a behavioral health condition receives treatment, 20%. That's not the case for other pediatric conditions. Most children with asthma, for example, receive treatment. Virtually all of those who experience things like cancer or cystic fibrosis receive treatment. And there is evidence suggesting that one of the primary reasons for this disparity is stigma. Stigma can isolate people. For those who experience mental, emotional, and behavioral health conditions, there can be a cost to seeking care. And so before we proceed, we tend to evaluate that cost very carefully. In one study conducted within the last decade, up to 2/3 of parents said that they wouldn't want their child to become friends with a peer experiencing ADHD or depression. They indicated that they wouldn't want either of those diagnoses living next door. And that is the family experience of stigma. It is a process of judgment, exclusion, and isolation that really happens in slow motion as people come to believe that your family is somehow different. It is the experience of your 7-year-old son wondering why he wasn't invited to the birthday party. It is the experience of your 9-year-old daughter wondering why her friend isn't allowed to come to your house to spend a Saturday. It is your children's elementary school principal telling you that she was unable to do her job that day because she was forced to deal with your child. And, for most of us, we believe that our child is their job. In another study, this time a study of adolescents, researchers found that the stereotypes and prejudices that support stigma, that lead to stigma, are well established by the time children reach high school. And hearing what I just said, that seems like no surprise. One of the most powerful antidotes to the thoughts and feelings that give rise to stigma is awareness. You'll hear me say that a lot today. So today I'm bringing my experience as a parent, a parent who's looked into the eyes of that 7-year-old and who has wiped the tears from the face of that sweet 9-year-old Saturday after Saturday after Saturday. I'll be sharing some facts and figures and a few stories, but what I really hope you'll take away is a little bit of the feeling of the family experience and maybe a commitment to move toward change, not only to stand against stigma, but to act in a way that changes attitudes and moves us to a culture of understanding, of inclusion, where families don't fear other families, and in which we can all be appreciated for the beautiful, extraordinary fullness that we bring. I would like to take just a moment to introduce the agency for which I work, an amazing agency. Oregon Family Support Network serves families caring for children who experience complex behavioral, emotional, and mental health conditions through one-to-one peer support, as well as support groups, a warm line, training, and advocacy. We meet families just where they are, helping them to draw on their expressed needs, their expressed traditions as they make their way. And as families supporting other families, we know in a very real way how painful it is, how painful it can be to feel isolated, to feel alone. We know the power really that comes from the validation and empathy, which can only be provided by someone who really knows the experience. As an organization, we believe that every family has the right to be heard and understood. And it is with that vision that we work to support and educate and advocate with and empower families like our own. So, as I said, awareness and interaction have been shown to be two of the most powerful answers to stigma. And so today we're going to first come to a common understanding of the term stigma, of all that goes into that. We're going to explore the family experience as reported by nearly 300 parents and caregivers with whom I've had the privilege to interact. We'll look at how stigma becomes normalized within systems and institutions, and the major role of implicit or unconscious bias in that process. We'll explore how service systems and providers might more effectively include the lived experience, regard the lived experience or the context expertise of families, and what all of us can do in the spirit of change. Stigma is something that happens between and among people. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's always negative. It occurs both at an individual level and at the level of institutions and society. And it's actually been likened to other kinds of systemic oppression, sexism, racism, ageism, the isms. And it can impact opportunity, inclusion, equity. Irving Goffman was a sociologist who did a lifetime of work on the ways in which people interact with one another. He was a pioneer in using qualitative research approaches to understand stigma. That means he interacted with people. He talked to people in order to understand their experiences. And he defined stigma as the process by which the reaction of others interferes with how we see ourselves. He called it undesired differentness, undesired differentness. And he also noted that stigma is really heavily influenced by power. At the individual level, he attributed this to the fact that those whom we deem to have more authority really have a greater impact on how we see ourselves. And we'll talk about that more as we move forward. But let me take you back just for a moment to when you were a child and someone, a teacher you admired, or maybe a parent told you that you were really good at something, right? Remember how you felt. Remember what that felt like. And you maybe stood a little taller in that moment. And then most of us have also had the same people suggest that maybe there was something we didn't do as well, right? If a teacher told you that you weren't an artist, or your mother suggested that math was not your strong suit, you likely didn't submit your next drawing to the art show. And maybe you didn't raise your hand to share your problem-solving skills in front of the class. Their reaction to your work, to you, affected how you saw your own abilities. So if a person believes something about another and labels them and places them into a group according to that thought, that's stereotyping. And stereotyping is one of three elements that contribute to stigma. Stereotypes are not intrinsically bad. They're not intrinsically harmful. They are a mental shortcut, a way of structuring knowledge which reflects a particular worldview, which reflects how we think. We all use stereotypes and labels. They may or may not be valid. They may or may not be correct, but they're a representation of how we think. Keep that in mind. They're not a representation of the other person. They're a representation of how we think, how we've been conditioned to think. Prejudice, another element contributing to stigma, is how we feel. It's effective. The stereotype is the difference we see. And then when we begin to assign an emotion to that difference, it could be fear, disgust, anger, that's prejudice. That's bias against a person or a group of people because of a difference we perceive. And then if the emotion is followed by behavior, I don't want these people to be a part of my group, that's discrimination. Stigmatization requires all three. And just a concrete example from the family experience, a child may struggle to meet behavioral expectations in school. And that child is almost immediately judged and labeled as a problem or a bad kid. The parent may be judged, stereotyped by school personnel as disengaged or somehow ineffectual. And then the school personnel may become frustrated or angry that the parent is uncaring or lacks control. That's the bias. Then the child may be excluded from recess or may be excluded from extracurricular activities, and the parent may not be heard or seen as an effective advocate for their child's needs. The parent may sort of be erased from the process. That is discrimination. That is stigmatization. And this is not an unusual story. It's something that families experience all the time. The fact that it is so common is an indication of how deeply rooted, how deeply entrenched stigmatization is within our child serving systems and more really in our society. The society, the culture upon which our service systems, our caring systems were built. These judgments, fears, and discriminatory treatment, and we'll talk about this more down the line, have been normalized. And I would like to take just a step back and look at the broader view in the example I just gave. Children who express distress through challenging behavior in school do indeed disrupt a classroom sometimes. It can be really difficult for teachers and other school personnel to handle this. Some days it may feel impossible. You know, how do you manage a room full of 25 or 30 kids when one needs so much attention? It's important to acknowledge that all often falls to a classroom teacher. This is huge. This is huge. There is a cascade. And the actions that we see, the labeling, the separating, those are default actions. And sometimes they're default actions because there aren't really other viable alternatives, which is the problem. The default is the cultural conditioning that supports stigmatization. It is the labeling, the name calling, the separation, because sometimes there are no other alternatives. It's been normalized. But we know that a child's behavior is an expression of a need, right? A teacher's behavior, a principal's behavior, to go back to my earlier example, is an expression of need, sometimes distress. None of those are bad people. The behavior is not the person. It's an expression, as I said, of distress, of something that may be missing, alternatives to labeling or name calling or separation. So if we label first, we stereotype, failing to get curious about the behavior. If we do that, we can never, ever get to the root of the problem, which means there can be no solution. We stay stuck. We stay in the societal norms that lead to stigmatization. And again, not all stereotypes lead to prejudice or discriminatory behavior, but once the stereotype has occurred, once the label has been applied, it takes active processing, a sort of reflection in real time, reflection in action, to recognize that we've done that, to recognize the label, and then to challenge it, to reject it. The unraveling of a stereotype is an intentional process. That doesn't happen automatically. So as human beings, we naturally group people. That's a part of the judgment, right? We look for sameness. Think about a time maybe when you've been to a social event or a face-to-face meeting or some other large gathering where you don't know anyone well. The first thing you do, I'm a major introvert, this really applies for me. the first thing you do when you walk into the room is to look for something familiar, someone you recognize, or someone with whom you might have something, anything in common. So when I look around the room here, so to speak, because I can't see anybody, I see a group of human beings. I infer that you're all here because you have some interest in the ways in which families and caregivers experience stigma. And I will admit to being a little apprehensive about whether I'm providing today what will meet your expectations. Maybe you're feeling that a little bit too. That first statement is a statement of fact. We are all human beings. The second is an assumption, a judgment, and we all make judgments. And the third is really a statement of fear. These are qualities which we all share. As human beings, we have hundreds of things in common. Among them are the capacity for judgment, which we use all day, every day, in every interaction. We share the capacity for fear, a natural reaction to perceived differences. And importantly, we also share a need to belong, the need for a social identity, or to belong within a group that has shared beliefs. That's how we know we fit. That tells us we fit somewhere. So simply put, in establishing our social identities, we naturally categorize people according to perceived differences and sameness. We look for folks we know in that big room, right? We construct in groups and out groups, us and them groups. And if you can't quite relate to that, maybe go back to middle school and remember how important it was to belong, to sit at the table with the cool kids or the smart kids or the athletes or the gamers, or with another group to which you were really attracted then. The fact is that within our groups, we all belong to numerous groups. We all have multiple social identities, and multiple groups to which we belong. And as individuals, we really stand at the point of their intersection. Stigma reduces us based on membership in a single group, or maybe multiple groups that someone in a position of relative power has deemed undesirable. And unchecked, that can become the way we think of ourselves, that the stigmatized group can become our identity. So let's just take a moment to briefly look at the different types of stigma and where family stigma fits into the scheme. Public stigma can be thought of as the dominant cultural norms regarding a group of people, whether certain identities, the identities of those groups like mental illness, for example, are socially devalued, are considered less than. It is the stereotypes, the prejudice, and the discriminatory attitudes that exist at a societal level toward a group of people. Institutional stigma or structural stigma is where organizations intentionally, or I think more often unintentionally, limit opportunities. And this applies to institutions of all kinds, from service agencies to governments. Institutional stigma is related to the concept of structural racism, where institutional norms result in and perpetuate unfair advantage or unfair or harmful treatment based on perceived differences. And these things are often codified in policy and in standards of behavior, sort of just the way we do it thing. And I mentioned that sometimes I believe these are unintentional. Once attention has been drawn to these things, it can no longer be unintentional. There is a will to perpetuate the differences, the stigmatizing attitudes. Um, and then self-stigma is the internalized shame and blame and self-doubt that may be associated with experiencing a behavioral health condition. This is one of the reasons that people don't seek care as early as they might. 90%, 9 in 10 people, this blows me away, who experience a mental or behavioral health condition report that they're affected by stigma. That's huge. And if there's a little voice in the back of your head right now attributing that experience to a person's condition or to a diagnosis, you're stereotyping. It happens just that easily. This is the seed of stigma. We all do it. And the question is, can you catch yourself in the moment and challenge the belief from which those thoughts arise? And then family stigma is really an extension of self-stigma. It's prejudice and discrimination by association. And this is really what we're focused on today. You can't exactly separate all of these types of stigma, but we're really talking about the family experience and the experience shared by so many of us who parent or provide care to children or other loved ones who live with behavioral health conditions. And one way to think about it, the societal norms contribute to all of this. They feed all of this. And one way really to think about it, I think, is that self-stigma and family stigma are how attitudes are internalized at the individual level, how it feels. Public and institutional stigma are how those attitudes are enacted, how they're imposed by others. And as you can infer from this diagram, stigma is a self-perpetuating entity. It's been characterized as a cycle of sorts, which always begins with a label. Stigmatized people are always stigmatized in relation to some standard. As I said at the top, stigma doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so some socially constructed standard provides for stigma. The so-called standard or norm exists in relation to those who stand outside of it, us and them. And one of the things that Goffman said of this is that stigma is neither in the entity, doesn't belong to the person or group that is being stigmatized, nor does it belong to the person or group making the judgment. He believed that stigma exists in the relationship between the attribute and a particular audience, the judging group, right? So to give sort of a silly example, and there are other examples that are not quite so silly, but there's nothing particularly stigmatized about big feet. Big feet are a thing. But if a person with big feet suddenly finds themselves in a group of people who have smaller feet, the individual whose feet are big might be labeled, might be judged, placed into a separate category, and maybe stigmatized. Stigma then lies not with a person, but in the relationship between a dominant attitude and an audience, a group who views that attribute as less than desirable. The dominant attitude, the dominant group, holds power. And stigma exists when elements of labeling, stereotyping, separation, and discrimination occur together in a power situation that allows them. Keyword, that allows them. This is a choice. Families of children who experience behavioral health conditions, for example, find this in their neighborhoods, in school, and unfortunately within the helping systems. Stereotypes influence what or whom we see, right? The most prominent physical features that a person has, like sex, um, uh, ethnicity, race, those trigger the most rapid categorizations. Labeling, those are the things we see first, we label them. And then once that label is applied, that's who we continue to see. And from there, we generalize and infer. Stereotypes really prevent us from recognizing the variability, the beauty, the complexity, the uniqueness that actually exists across people within a particular group. Because once we've judged, once we've stereotyped, we sort of apply the they're all alike frame. When we recognize difference in people, human beings tend to see it as wrong. We distance ourselves. That is a situation that just isn't conducive to openness, to understanding, to curiosity, to relationship. So that brings us to family experience. What is the family experience? In my work with parents and caregivers over the past few years, I have been honored to meet some of the strongest people I've ever known. And as I've mentioned, the details of each of our experiences are unique. They're different. There's also a common experience, a shared experience that is noted by all families. So what is that? Research indicates that when a child carries a diagnosis of mental illness, many adults infer that that child is dangerous off the top. They prefer distance from the young person and from the family, and they're likely to blame the family for what they're observing, from what they're judging. And again, these attitudes are actually trending downward, but they still exist. And when this is the way adults feel, these are the attitudes, the stereotypical beliefs, which they pass on knowingly or not to their children. It reinforces the bias that leads to discrimination. And honestly, I have to say, some days it is really hard to engage in this discussion about the family experience, because even just describing the experiences of families can feel marginalizing. I was with a group recently, an interdisciplinary group, and someone said, sometimes families feel judged even when we're not judging. And I can say two things about this. First, it's true. And that is what it is to be in a stigmatized group. And second, if those words are taken literally, families feel judged even when we're not judging, it reveals that families are, at least some of the time, judged. So where that is the experience, it becomes the expectation. A person or group who's been stigmatized or marginalized can't just decide to undo that. They can't just decide to destigmatize themselves. This exists within power relationships. And if it's difficult to see this within the context of mental health, think about it in terms of other marginalized groups in our society. No, unfortunately, examples abound. So I've spoken now with about 300 families and caregivers of children who experience serious emotional disorders and developmental disabilities. And from these conversations, three essential themes emerged. One had to do with access to services. Another with the fact that families experience all kinds of indignities, including frank trauma in their relationships with the caring systems. And the one most pertinent to our conversation today was that families feel as if they're not seen in context. They're not seen as whole or multidimensional. They're often reduced to the immediate crisis, or they're associated with their child's behavior and then ultimately the diagnosis. For example, I'll share just a few quotes of statements made by family members as They were sharing their stories of relationships with providers. And I'm really using the word provider very broadly. I don't want to single anyone out because this happens across the board. So I'm referring to school personnel, medical providers, mental health providers, the agencies who employ and support them. But someone in the group was telling a story of describing her experiences with her child, and the person she was in front of assumed that she was an addict. Another said, she told me I should discipline my child. This one is really common when families call 911, when they call for emergency support. It also often comes, we hear this first from family and friends. So much baby talk. She spoke to me like I was 3. She announced to the group that this is therapy 101. He said, families like yours, but he didn't know my family. His diagnosis were ODD, and we were the ODD parents. And now I'll invite you just to notice what's going on within you, within your body, as you hear these statements without judgment. Just notice what's going on for you. If you're a parent, you may resonate with these statements because you've heard them. If you were a provider or affiliated with a provider agency or a school or some other sort of organization, you may be having another kind of reaction. So is it empathy, compassion for what these families felt? Is it disbelief? Are these idiosyncratic events? Is it judgment? Is it defensiveness? Maybe in part because of the way I presented the information. Just notice. These are the experiences of families in their own words. And I think that we can assume that the intent, and I think this is important, we can assume that the intent of each of these statements was to help, right? But if you just take the words, if you look at the words, the impact is different than that. Judgment, prescription, infantilization, subordination, ignorance, and stereotyping. And even if you would characterize them differently, none of them is particularly helpful, and all are in some way marginalizing, even if the intent is not that. We know that stigma is born of a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding, and of fear, right? We fear people who we perceive to be different. So even if one holds experience or expertise in a particular discipline, they don't necessarily have expertise in the experience of families, in the experience of the service user. So they assume and they judge. And a lack of understanding or an unwillingness to understand in curiosity can lead to judgment, which leads sometimes to bias, which leads sometimes to discrimination. Stigmatization often happens beneath consciousness. We fear difference. And the experience of family stigma, unfortunately, really begins long before we become involved with the behavioral health system. It is woven into the fabric of our society, our common culture, and within our subcultures. It happens within relationships. It happens within institutions and our relationships with the institutions. I remember, because I can't not, when my son was in first grade, and behavioral symptoms, which we had been bringing to providers since he came to us at the age of 22 months through foster care, started to escalate. And without a lot of curiosity around it, he was labeled by the school as disruptive and a lot of other things, but I'll stop there. We were new to the area at the time, and so we sought the help of a pediatrician who we hoped might serve as a guide to other services, as a referral source. And after spending 15 minutes with our child at the age of 6, she labeled him a bad boy out loud and suggested that his life trajectory was unpromising. I, as a parent who wondered what on earth we were doing wrong, apologized all over the place. I apologized sometimes, a lot of the time, actually, instead of asking questions. And at some point, it became clear that our child would need more than traditional outpatient therapy. And as we began to make our way through more intensive services, we realized that we were under scrutiny. We were being evaluated and reduced by assumption and judgment. And by that time, I had stopped apologizing and I bit back. That earned me some labels. And in sharing these experiences about our family, I've just described each of the levels of stigma: public, institutional, self, and family. Every family speaks of these experiences. And I'm going to pause here and create this sort of awkward silence and just let this slide play. Take a look. This is a universal experience for families. And this is what can happen before we ever meet the behavioral health system. And again, just sort of watch the function of labeling. The practical function of labeling is separation, us and them. Stigmatization is an interactive social process. The way it feels is that if the typical, it feels like all the support structures. So our circle of families and friends, and then the broader circle of systemic support. It feels as though the support structures have all banished you for things they perceive to be different, for things they don't understand. Their judgments, their biases reinforce one another. And then there we are. And that's often where we enter the behavioral health system. And we're already carrying a lot, right? And then we hear things, questions that sound accusatory. Those questions or statements may not be intended to blame or shame. The impact is different than that. The effect of some questions, why didn't you? What did you do? What didn't you do? Is isolating. You're afraid sometimes to answer questions because you feel as if you'll be blamed. And then sometimes you begin to ask those questions of yourself. You begin to blame yourself. And then sometimes also the experience includes hearing what's being said about you. One mom talked about sitting in a conference room with the door open. This was in a congregate care setting. And she overheard a conversation about a family. She didn't know if they were talking about her family, but some of what she heard included the statements that you just saw. She's a piece of work. You just can't help those people. Those people. Sometimes judgment is inferred. Sometimes it's implied. Sometimes it's said out loud. But if it's there, no matter what the circumstances, no matter how loudly or not it is spoken, it comes into the room. This is the family experience. So again, I invite you to check in with yourself. How does hearing this make you feel? What judgments are you making? And of course, not all judgments are negative. But how are you evaluating what I'm saying is the family experience? We're wired to recognize and respond to what we perceive as differences. And we're not always aware of the negative assessments we make. This is implicit bias. But we can become aware. It's an intentional pause. It takes an intentional pause when you notice a sensation as someone is speaking, whether it's me here today or a family that you happen to be interacting with, or a friend for that matter. If you render an automatic judgment, where is that coming from? What is the experience within you? What is the conditioning that you've had that causes that judgment? And can you challenge it? Can you replace it? And do you want to? If you can replace the initial judgment, the label, the stereotype, bias doesn't happen as readily. And without bias, discrimination doesn't happen. And pretty soon, there's no stigma. We can begin to actually value differences and uniqueness before we fear them. It takes intention, it takes effort. Someone said, and I am sorry not to have the name, but bias is the thumbprint of culture on our minds. And we're reflecting what our culture is teaching us. That's so true. It starts with a label, a stereotype. A researcher named Jordan Axe has used the word mind bugs. I love this to refer to the ingrained patterns of thought that lead to errors in how we perceive, in how we remember and reason and make decisions. We all stand in different places, and what we experience becomes how we see our worldview. We perceive differently depending upon our experiences. So in this discussion, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, but I'm asking you within the frame of the family experience, complemented by the frame of your own experience, your worldview, to become more aware. And I'll use another example, a couple of examples which are outside of behavioral health, outside of implicit bias, but I think really illustrate the mechanisms. The first is an example of how when we don't have complete information, we fill in the blanks. And the second has to do with what happens when we separate people into arbitrary groups and how the separation may affect what we see or infer. This is one of my favorite examples of perceptual differences. So do you see the dancer? The dancer is rotating. I hope you can all see that. Do you see the dancer rotating clockwise or counterclockwise? And are you able to change the direction of movement? And if you can, is it difficult to reverse, or does that happen easily for you? Most people, about 2/3, see the image first rotating clockwise. And this particular image has been studied a lot, and there are several theories around it. At its basis, though, there's missing information. There are no depth or directional cues in the image. So as human beings, we automatically make inferences. And this happens to be an illusion of visual perception, but it is an example of how when we're presented with limited information, we fill in the blanks. And we do it automatically beneath consciousness. We all do that, no matter what our labels, no matter where we sit around the table. Most people are able to reverse the direction of motion of this image, but it takes active effort. It takes some focus and concentration, conscious effort. Addressing implicit bias is a conscious effort. The question is always, do you want to? Do you feel you need to? So this next example illustrates the automaticity with which we judge when we perceive difference. This is an experiment which involved having research participants judge the length of 6 lines. And in one of the experimental conditions, participants simply saw 6 lines, as in the top frame. And in the other, the lines were categorized into 2 groups, one comprising 3 shorter lines and one comprising the 3 longer lines. Lines C and D, the middle lines, were seen as the same length in the non-categorized condition. But where the 2 groups were separated, where they were differentiated, line C was perceived as longer. They are actually the same length, and I think that's easy to appreciate. They were perceived, when they were separated into longer and shorter, as longer. So categorization into 2 groups, the short lines group, the long lines group, us and them, produced a perceptual bias such that the 2 groups, which contain differences, were actually seen as more different than they really are. This is what happens when we categorize people. We tend to see people who belong to the groups with which we identify, big-footed or small-footed, long or short, as more similar than they actually are. So we see our in-groups as more similar, and we judge people from different groups as more different than they actually are. And so again, without self-judgment, go back to how you felt when I was describing the family experience. Notice, just notice. The normalization of stigma, this refers to the ways in which ideas and attitudes and ways of being become integrated into everyday, into what we consider typical within a given context. They're taken for granted, so we don't really think about them. We don't regard them at all. When something is normalized, deviations from that routine are viewed as wrong. Stigmatized people or groups are always, as I said before, stigmatized in relation, to another group of people who are deemed to be more typical. And those people are always seen as typical in relation to groups who are stigmatized. We need other in order to understand self. And as an example gone wrong of this, think about the dominant culture in relation to racial minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, right? Think about the effect of the dominant cultural norms on groups of people who are often marginalized. This is how reducing people to labels just kind of happens. It's normalized, it goes unchecked. As it is experienced at the individual level, the family is out of the picture, right? The beautiful big old family is out of the picture, and all that can be seen is the label, whether it's the judgment of the family, the parent that's sitting with a provider interacting, or whether it's a diagnostic label. There was another study in which students were offered vignettes, short scenarios that were identical, except that the person being described in the scenario was characterized as having either cancer or schizophrenia. This will come as no surprise, I hope, after where we've been so far, but those with schizophrenia were perceived as less desirable to have as a friend, less able to function in the community. And what was interesting about this study is that changing the label, leaving everything else about the scenario alone, and changing that label changed participants' perceptions and expectations of the individuals being described. And these studies that I'm referring to today are not isolated reports. The results have been replicated over and over. And language is also big. I really appreciate the slide that comes at the beginning of these presentations that references first person language. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. It's sort of a presentation in itself, but our brains respond to words in an unconscious, beneath conscious process known as associative activation. When we see or hear a word, our brain forms an idea, and that's followed by an emotion, which often produces an action or a reaction. Language produces a cascade of activity with no series or pattern of cognitive, emotional, and physical responses. We respond to words without really even realizing it. So as a result, pejorative or stigmatizing language has an immediate adverse reaction, a visceral reaction, when we hear words like disruptive or weird kid or that mom, those people, we immediately attach to the label simply because of the language that was used. That's the picture that we draw in our minds. It happens beneath consciousness. We actually have to stop and notice with intention. That is the solution. We have to become aware first and curious. Families, it is said, are the experts in their own experience. The family must be known in order for the child to be known. We hear statements like this a lot. We've seen, I've seen many kids like your son, dozens of kids, hundreds of kids like this. But you're sitting with an individual. You have to see the individual. I remember someone saying to me very early in my career in a different field, when you're talking to someone about the potential adverse effects of a surgical procedure, which are always pretty minuscule, or a medication, again, which are always pretty unlikely, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how unlikely. It doesn't matter if it doesn't happen to most people if you're the one who experiences the adverse effect. We deal with individuals. It's important to know individuals, and children live within families. They cannot exist separate as apart from their families. So it's important to know the family context as well, to challenge challenge the judgments, the stereotypes, the sort of what we think we know things. And to illustrate this, I'll just bring together a couple of final examples to introduce you by way of description to a couple of people. One is a boy, the other a girl, a young woman, and I'm going to list attributes of their experiences. And as you hear the statements, as you hear me, I'm going to read them from the slide. As you hear me reading these statements, really focus on the physical sensations, what's happening for you. Emotion occurs first as sensation, whether we're aware of it or not. So it's always useful to just kind of check in with your gut. And then I'll invite you to listen to your thoughts, to your assessments, automatic assessments of their respective situations. Take mental note. This is just for you. There's no obligation to type anything into chat or to reveal what's going on. Don't think too hard. Don't be too self-critical. Don't be self-critical. If you can avoid it, just listen to what comes up inside your head. There's no need to censor or to correct anything. Then also notice think about how closely you identify with any of the statements that I'm making, okay? So visceral sensations, automatic thoughts, and how much you identify. He's disruptive in school. He takes food out of the garbage sometimes at school. He is excluded from extracurricular activities. He's frequently excluded from school altogether. His aggressive behavior resulted sometimes in school lockdowns. He ran away from school and from home. He fashioned weapons from household objects and he hid them. He displayed frequent aggression toward family members, destruction of property sometimes. And I can't see the last one, so I'll leave it there. You get the idea. And now I'm going to list a number of attributes describing the girl's experience, the same thing. Notice visceral sensations, automatic thoughts, and how much you identify. Good student, school athlete, musician. She played flute with a youth symphony. She worked as a camp counselor. She was a student advocate and a leader. She majored in international politics and psychology in college. She founded and hosted a podcast. She received numerous honors and awards. Upon graduation, she was hired by a major financial institution, and she is currently exploring and applying to graduate schools. So just recall for yourselves what thoughts went through your mind. Did you characterize in any way the families that these children might have come from? And if you did, how? How did you characterize them? How about the neighborhoods that maybe they lived in? Did you think about that sort of thing? What were your first thoughts when you heard each statement? What did you maybe perceive? What did you think, if you thought anything, about their socioeconomic status, about their opportunities, about their parents? Was one of these kids more likely to be from a single parent family? Again, without judging yourself, what labels came up in your mind? What groups did you assign these individuals to? Did you meet the stories with curiosity? Did you want to know more? And if so, was it curiosity or was it more like judgment? And were the judgments positive or negative? Because judgment can be either. So I can tell you that hearing of the boys' experiences, I feel it in my gut. I feel a little sick, honestly. And while I can relate to those experiences, I don't want to be those people. That's often true for families. And hearing of the girls' experience, I feel it totally in my heart. I have 5 children. I'd love to have those experiences 5 times. Through the unconscious bias that lives inside all of us, we place people in groups. We feel closer to people whom we perceive to be more like us. We project positive attributes or negative about people without knowing them at all. We seek to confirm what we think we know. We change our thinking often to align with the group. Think about that. We automatically accept the opinions of those who we perceive to have more power or more authority or prominence. We treat people based on stereotypes that we've formed, which may or may not be valid. We associate things that are really not related at all. We rely on our emotions sometimes to draw conclusions. We attribute what motivates behavior without adequate context, sometimes without any context. And we defer to the way it's always been done. So this list, these things that you see, these are all cognitive fallacies, and they're difficult to correct because they're rooted in human being and they're reinforced by our societal norms. They're perpetuated by the culture we live in, and we must actively challenge them. So let's go back for a second to the descriptions of the experience. As you were thinking about these two people, did you consider the possibility, maybe, that they could come from the same family? These children are, in fact, siblings. Not every family looks alike. Even when children bear the same diagnostic label as dozens or hundreds of others, there's more to the story. Curiosity goes a really long way. And this is my family, and those are my children. And I am extraordinarily proud of both of them. They've both accomplished huge things in their short lives. So one final thing, I like to look at beautiful things. That's sort of what keeps me centered. So just to make sure I've made the point. So look at the mountain and describe what you see. Describe the colors you see. And when you look at the mountain, think about what textures you can appreciate. Just notice, just notice. Things look really different when you see them close up. And that's what each of us brings to the table in the form of our unique experience, lived experience, the family experience, educational experience, or professional experience or expertise. We all bring something which contributes to the texture. And it's all needed. It's all necessary in order for people and families to thrive. If we separate groups, stigmatize groups, we may overlook really important information. We exclude people. When individuals and families are stigmatized, that is the effect. We sort of erase them. We erase the experiences that they have. The mental health treatment system is one of the most commonly cited sources of structural stigma. And it doesn't have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. Oppressive systems are built to perpetuate themselves. Change is an intentional process. So as we've seen, the labeling, stereotyping, and unconscious biases that lead to stigmatization can really sometimes be quite subtle. Some of the ways and this is especially present in the diversity and inclusion literature, some of the ways of confronting bias and countering stigma is to get to know people and to examine our own assumptions, to notice, to be aware when we're making judgments, to examine our assumptions. And when we find errors in our assumptions and when we replace them, we behave very differently with people. We no longer fear them. So one of the best ways of challenging stereotypes is by becoming curious, by getting to know people. We all need to see who's in front of us before we judge who's in front of us. And I thank you for your time. I would be happy to take any questions. I'm going to put down my slides.
Well, Carol, thank you for such an illuminating and just humane presentation. There's a number of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to knock off probably an easier one first, which is, does Oregon Family Support Network only serve people residing in Oregon?
It does.
Yeah,
We are a
okay.
family-run organization in the state. There are, I will say, in many other states, there are family-run organizations and other sorts of peer organizations. And if you Google FREDLA, FREDLA, the Family Run Executive Director Leadership Association, I believe there's a listing
Great. Thank you so much.
of family
I'm
run
seeing,
organizations.
yeah, I'm seeing another great question. What training improvements need to be made for providers to avoid contributing to stigma despite perhaps original intentions to the contrary, to not reinforce stigma?
You know, that is such a brilliant question, and it is so easy to kind of pile on providers and to blame the next person up. And that's not effective. That's just another kind of separation. These problems are so entrenched in our society that it will take a lot to unravel them. I do believe that it starts at an individual level. So, you know, I know that within so many schools, these issues are addressed as a single lecture or maybe a couple. But awareness, again, awareness at every level, awareness in schools, awareness in community groups, in society. I just lost your sound, Gabrielle. I can see you're
Oh,
talking.
sorry. I'm seeing a couple questions related to the really thorny topic of an identity that's marginalized, mixing potentially with religious identity. And specifically, that's LGBTQIA plus community members and religious situations, and the compounding of different factors here, mental health diagnoses, a marginalized identity, maybe a less than accepting religious situation. Can you speak at all to that? I know it's a very thorny question that may touch upon some very, very personal issues here for many people.
That again is a huge issue. I identify as a part of the queer community,
Hmm.
and I think that, you know, as difficult as it is, and we from stigmatized positions we can lead. I believe that. I believe that we can use our voices and our power to influence, and I think we need to. The way that I do that, and I'm not going to provide a prescription, but the way that I do that is to try to understand the point of view that I may not agree with. The point of view, you know, when we sit in face to face with one another, we're all judging one another. So when I feel a judgment, you know, when someone hits a nerve with me because of a judgment they're making or a statement they've made, what about my experience has informed that judgment, and can I challenge it? We're entitled to different perspectives and different points of view. We are not entitled to discriminate because of them. And that's where the difference comes in. So if we can challenge the stereotype and come to a mutual understanding of difference and the richness of difference, then the stereotype doesn't, or the stigma doesn't need to happen.
Yeah, on a related note, I'm seeing a question as well. As a parent, how do you support your adult child with internalized self-stigma and non-disclosure? The fear is that they won't be understood or become further alienated in their faith community.
Yes. And unconditional positive regard. See them, even if you are not having those experiences, if they relate that to you, they're telling their truth. That's what they're experiencing. Those are real things. See them. Provide whatever support you can. You cannot change someone else's perspective, but see your child.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you for that. I'm seeing a question that we often self-stigmatize in grief, and what would you recommend to help people begin to question and perhaps resist that stigma?
When we stigmatize ourselves in grief, I'm going to sort of avoid answering that because it's not within my scope. What I would say to folks who are feeling self-judgment, and we all do that too. We've all got those voices in the back of our heads. The way that I deal with it is to allow it, to become curious, to use the same tools with myself that I might use with someone else who I'm judging. Why am I judging myself? Why do I feel that way? Allow it. It's a process. It doesn't go away overnight, but continue the process.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, we had a recent webinar on grief, and I would suggest that if folks want to look a little more on grief, there's some MHTTC network resources, and I'm sure my colleague Peyton might be able to dig that up, but if not, we might be able to share that later. But grief is such a complex topic. Thank you for speaking to it, even um, um, not as in depth as perhaps the questioner wanted. I see some curiosity in the question and answers as well about if the quotes you use from families were gathered from personal interactions or evaluations or a study, and also I think some other questions about your use of research in your presentation. Could you speak to that?
Sure. The all of the quotes were a result of direct face-to-face conversations that I've had with families. Some of them were one-to-one conversations, and many of them were a part of listening sessions that were intended to uncover the family experience and what families believe are important to see within system change.
Fantastic. Um, there's a question here that is saying, based on research, is bias our nature or nurture,
Ooh,
or would you resist that binary?
yeah, it is both. It's evolutionary, right? We had to recognizing other and forming groups helped us in our evolutionary process. It put us with groups that allowed us to protect and defend and care for ourselves, and it separated from groups who might have harmed us. So it is within us, and it no longer, we don't need that anymore. And then it grows within our environments and just within our it's woven into our social fabric.
So true. Judgment is a little inescapable, but I liked how you opened a space for pausing, reflecting, and res responding rather than reacting. I really appreciated that. Um, I had mentioned in our introduction that our center's focus is on evidence-based practices, and we've certainly had many dialogues with many different groups and presenters over time about how that can be problematic, that scientific empirical research isn't always done on every group. And I'm not really familiar with the state of that kind of research for families. And I'm seeing in the Q&A box some questions about, your perspective about how strictly do you follow, and I might not be phrasing this ideally, uh, evidence-based versus, say, evidence-informed versus best practices. Could you speak to that? I know it's again maybe a thornier debate that we're wading into here. I can just say that in terms of cultural adaptations, there's a lot of very vigorous debate around evidence-based practices, and I'm assuming in the family space as well.
In the family space as well, one of the things that happens is that numbers are gathered after someone has formed a judgment, an opinion. And ultimately, the researcher or whoever is collecting the numbers hopes to find information, and I will say I'm generalizing here, but hopes to find information in support of their theory or a proposed thesis. That doesn't always happen. And I think there is a lot of honesty and integrity in reporting when that doesn't happen. Um, but really to get, and I think my last slide with the mountain spoke to the visual of this. It is impossible to really get to the texture of one's experience without having a conversation about it. So what is reflected in the quantitative research literature doesn't necessarily reflect the experiences, the lived experiences of those who are living this experience. And so there has to be some sort of triangulation. And in terms of practice-based evidence, there is a lovely concept, and this is in some of the DEI literature on evidence-based practice-based evidence. Did I say that backwards? So evidence-based practice is what we know. Practice-based evidence means that you take the experiences of the individuals sitting in front of you, that family, that individual, that culture, and apply those within the space of a treatment plan or in the space of your conversations. It's so humane. It makes such sense.
Carol, what's next for you? What do you look forward to, hope for? What keeps you going? Because I know you give so much.
Thank you for that. What I'm really looking forward to is the weekend. And I just spent a couple of weeks in the mountains in Washington backpacking by myself, and so my cup is full. And I just look forward to continuing this discussion. It's an ongoing discussion, so I'd like to continue to have it.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your not just information, but insight, wisdom, personal experience. Um, I'm glad your cup is full. We've often, especially in these post-COVID times, said, you can't fill others' cups when your own is empty very well. So we really appreciate you being here today. We really appreciate our audience for joining us today.